Welcome everybody to another Muskoka Conservancy webinar. Muskoka Conservancy is the Nature Conservancy of Muskoka. We work hard every day to protect properties that have special natural values. These include species-rich wetlands, key stretches of natural shoreline, all kinds of forest habitat, rock barrens, and more. So far, we have 44 conservation properties in our portfolio, and with your support, we can protect more of the land we love. There's no government funding for land trusts, and there's no charge for attending this webinar. We would, however, ask that you seriously consider becoming a member of Muskoka Conservancy or supporting the land trust with a small donation, whatever works for you. Please visit our website at muskokaconservancy.org for more information. So with that bit of business out of the way, it is my honor to introduce a very special presenter, Dr. Jane Young. Jane was born and raised in Toronto, but spent much of her working life in Prince George, BC, as a botany professor at the University of Northern British Columbia. She holds degrees from York University, University of Guelph, and a PhD from University of Toronto. In addition to her love for botany and conservation, she is also a strong advocate for women and animals. Jane is Vice President of the Muskoka chapter of the Canadian Federation of University Women, and is also chair of Women for Humane Canada, which is a group of like-minded women making positive change for animals in this country. She is thrilled to be on the board of Muskoka Conservancy, working with outstanding people to help protect beautiful Muskoka lands. Jane lives in Bracebridge with her husband Dave and a puppy mill survivor named Pebbles. And with that, Jane, welcome everybody. And Jane, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Aaron Scott, so much, and welcome everyone to this Muskoka Conservancy webinar, Winter Botany. I hope all of you are safe and well. And it is really thrilling to be presenting this webinar because I really miss teaching. so I retired early to follow other passions in addition to botany, but I'm just thrilled to be here and to do a little teaching. So hope you enjoy. So what is winter botany? The landscape of winter offers so much more than one would think. Deciduous trees or trees that lose their leaves in the winter can be identified just as easily, sometimes more easily, in the winter than any other time of the year. In the winter, when trees are dormant or sort of sleeping, the bark, twigs, and buds of trees can be used to identify them quite accurately. The twigs with their buds are the most reliant to use for identification. But bark is also used. It's a little more variable, particularly with the age of the tree. Like a bark of sugar maple could be quite different from sort of as a young tree compared to as an older tree. But if you get to know your trees a bit, it's like getting to know friends. You get to know them a little bit, see them more, and then you get to know them better. It's just like trees when you go out into the woods, or in your park or in your backyard, and you just get to know them and compare one from another, and you just are able to identify the bark a little more easily, unless it's something like paper birch, which is quite obviously a paper birch. So yes, so you'll be able to get to use bark as another identification feature too. But when we think about identifying plants in general, we think about their flowers and their fruits and their leaves in the spring, summer, and the fall. But leaves can be a bit variable in shape within a plant and between plants of the same species. So they might not be always the most reliant when it comes to identifying in those three seasons. Now, these are leaves from, just sort of schematic drawings of leaves from various tree species. And they don't vary too much within an individual tree or between trees of the same species. But you might get a little variation, let's say sugar maple leaves in the top of the trees compared to the bottom of the trees. That's because there are sun shade differences between those two environments. But there are some plants out there that leaves are quite variable on the same plant or within the same plant species from plant to plant. And I just want to talk a little bit about that. The leaves are what we call plastic. That is, they adapt to changing environmental conditions. And leaf shape, size, and thickness can vary as they try to be the most efficient at photosynthesis and water supply. And one of the most extreme examples, and something that I did pretty well all my graduate work on, is in aquatic plants. And one of the most extreme examples of leaf shape change due to environmental changes is with aquatic plants, when their leaf shapes can be very different on the same plant under the water compared to the leaves that are poking out of the water, or even the floating leaves. They can have 3 different types of leaves on the same plant. And we think they're changing their leaf shape just because they want to change due to their environment to become more efficient and to survive better. Sometimes with these aquatic plants, the leaves are so different in the air when they're terrestrial growing compared to under the water, and they've been named different names in the past just because they look so different. So just be careful with leaves when it comes to identifying some plants. But when it comes to flowers and fruits of plants, they're much more conservative. Those organs and their parts and shapes do not differ within a plant or between similar plants. And the reason for this is they want to survive. Plants want to survive and produce seeds for their continuing survival. So they must co-adapt with their pollinators, like on the left there, and with their seed dispersers, like on the right. So no wonder most of the identification of individual plants and classification of plants, of groups of plants, are based on their flower and their fruit shape and the number of parts, like the number of stamens, number of pistils, because plants just need to be that conservative. But let's go into the winter. And there's rarely leaves on trees. I would say there are some plants, like trees, that will have leaves still on the trees, and they might give you a little bit of an idea of what tree it is, but they're usually curled up and dry, like on the left there, the left picture. And the tree identifier must rely on other tree parts. Sometimes acorns will be left on some trees, but they'll be sometimes hard to see because they're up very high. But let's think of the tree parts that will give you the best job as far as identifying the tree, and that's namely the bark, the buds, and the twigs. And I'll just point here with beech here with a nice smooth bark, and the twig of beech where you've got the long slender buds. And all of us, I'm sure, know the paper birch with the shedding bark. That's actually my favorite tree. I just love it. And the buds of birch, on one birch species over here. So the twig with its buds and the bark prove to be identifiers for us, or identification features in the winter. So just a little bit about tree growth before we get going, since I taught botany and this is so much fun for me to talk about things like this. I just love trees and how they grow and develop. All plants, including trees, have what we call primary or green growth. That's sort of soft growth. And there are cell division areas that occur in the tips of shoots, sort of at the ends of branches here, and also in the ends of roots. And we call this extension growth because it enables trees, let's talk about trees, to extend out and reach the sun with their leaves. And woodiness is secondary growth. So as I mentioned, all plants have the primary growth. And some plants, like woody shrubs and trees, have what we call secondary growth. That's that hard, rigid growth. It increases the girth of trunks, for example, and also the girth of branches. It enables trees to grow tall and also allows them to survive in harsh conditions. And I mentioned secondary growth because we rely on the bark to identify trees, and that is part of secondary growth. So this slide here is actually one of the most important slides of the presentation. It is featuring the newest part of the branch, the end twig. Okay, so this would be a branch. This is getting older here towards the trunk of the basswood tree here. And this would be the newest part of growth here. And this end twig would have been produced last year in the spring, like it would have started to be produced because the end bud in this area here would have flushed to produce this part of the branch. And the cells within that bud that used to be here would divide and produce extension growth. That's what I talked about, that primary growth first, to extend out. And it's green growth, and it's really, really easy to miss because with trees, because the bud flushes, it extends out, and leaves are produced, and the shoot comes out, but the woodiness occurs quite rapidly pretty well along the same path as that extension growth. So you'll see that twig happen pretty quickly with the woodiness on the outside. Now, you can tell where this twig begins by noticing that none of the buds have flushed to produce new shoots. So the end twig have these buds on them, and there's no branching like down here. So this bud was produced last year also, but it flushed, but it is now called like a branch of branching out, where the new twig has not yet, but come the spring of this year, let's say twig is right outside your backyard and with basswood, and these buds will flush out, produce branches. This one will flush out and produce twigs something like this one, and so on and so forth in the years to come. The new part of the twig can also be sometimes a little different color. You can see it's a little more reddish color compared to the year before, which is a little browner, just due to more secondary growth occurring on that part of the branch. A little bit more, becomes a little browner sometimes. And the other way you can tell is you have sort of a collar. It might be hard to see here, but some of you might have noticed like a little sort of collar, sort of rough area in the bottom of the new twig. This is where the bud scales came off in order to form that new growth. So let's say this bud will flush in the spring. The bud scales, which is the outer portion of the bud, and it's the hard part, and it protects the inner part of the bud where the new little leaves are that are going to come out. So during the winter, you need that covering for the new shoot. And some plants will actually, they'll harbor all of the leaves in here to produce a new shoot in the spring, but some trees will produce the leaves, they'll grow out underneath here, these little baby leaves, and then they'll produce even more. So that depends on the tree species. So these bud scales are actually modified leaves that are produced at the end of the fall, covering that bud, and then they fall off and they leave these bud scale scars at the end. They are usually not used to identify these scars trees because they're quite small, but it gives you that indication of when the new growth has occurred. Excuse me. And I've got to tell you about the secondary growth in the tree too. This is a sort of cross section, or they call cookies, that come from part of a branch when you cut pieces in a cross section. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen like the look of this when a tree has been cut down or it's fallen down, and the tree trunk will have this look. And there's outer bark on the outside, and that's what we use for identifying trees. There's also inner bark to the inside, a little bit of area here. And then the wood of this particular tree, it's oak, encompasses, I'll just use my arrow here, all the way through. And you see the growth rings. This tree is fairly old. All these little rings here are growth rings. And this is the wood of the tree. So most of the woody part of trees is comprised of wood. But it's not to say it's, that's where the water is transported and minerals, but it's not to say that the inner bark, like the bark here, this part, or the outer bark, I should say, is, wait, I'm getting mixed up, sorry. This is the outer bark, and this is the inner bark, and this is the wood. So the inner bark allows for photosynthetic food to transport throughout the tree, very important, and the outer bark is there for protection. There are cell division layers here that will produce this outer and inner, or sort of the outer bark, and then the inner bark and the wood, there's another cell layer all the way around the tree that produces cell divisions to produce the wood and the inner bark. So these, there's two layers of cell division, and that produces your secondary growth. So trees are very, very busy in producing their tissues. Okay, so We're going to look at some types of bark here. And yes, if you're barking up the right tree, you'll be able to identify the tree. And these are just some examples because I'm going to go through different tree species later on in the talk. With on the left-hand side there, red oak is quite furrowed with sort of tall ridges compared to other barks that you might see. Down here with white oak, my arrow here is scaly and broken horizontally, so you see these lines here in the bark. And beech, you know, with the smooth bark, that's not too many plants or trees have smooth bark like beech. And the yellow birch, one way you can tell the difference between yellow and white birch is the yellow birch. In the younger stages, it does appear sort of yellowish and also peels sort of horizontal curly strips that don't readily peel off. Okay, so that's one difference. So there's some ideas sort of what bark can look like. With barks like this, with the ones to the left, I still go out in forests and wonder what type of tree I'm looking at. They all look gray to me, and they all gray to the eyes of people who don't really look at them closely. So don't worry, because sometimes it's very hard. But there are ways that you can identify trees without looking at the bark. As I mentioned, the twigs. And to see the ends of twigs on the mature trees is very hard because they're very, very tall. So invariably, they're going to have saplings around their mature kind of mother tree, and you'll see the twigs on them. And one thing I want to mention too is that if you're out and about now, and if you don't have snow in the area, just look on the ground. It's a little bit of a tip that you'll see leaves that have fallen from those trees, and you'll see red oak leaves on the bottom of the forest floor, and that'll definitely help you identify the tree. Excuse me. Okay, so this is quite fascinating that trees do breathe in the winter. And trees are able to breathe through their bark in all seasons, okay, through their bark. And they also breathe once they produce leaves, they also breathe. They also take in carbon dioxide and take in oxygen through their leaves a lot of times at night. We all think of plants doing photosynthesis and creating oxygen, which we're definitely like to thank trees for that. They also take up carbon, but when they also breathe, and that is required for metabolism, and they do so. They need to breathe through the winter to some degree, especially when they start to metabolize and start those divisions that I was talking to you about for creating secondary growth in the spring. So what happens is, I'm showing a picture down here again of that big cross section of the tree trunk. And the outer bark here, if you were to go take off a little piece of the bark and section it with a razor blade, look under a microscope and stain it a certain way. This is what botanists will do, and look under the microscope, and this is what this picture is all about. You'll notice that these cells up here, so we're looking quite microscopically here, they have large air spaces in them. It's quite porous. And the cells down here, which is sort of like underneath that rough bark, and then to the inside, if you get more and more, you'll get into the wood of the tree. And this is an air hole, and it's actually called a lenticel. And lenticels are used for identification in trees. And that's one of the reasons, besides them being very interesting, that I'm bringing them up. So they're porous tissue consisting of cells with these large intercellular spaces in twigs and branches, and they function as a pore and provide a pathway for oxygen to move into the tree to those internal tissues, which is otherwise impermeable to gases. So the rigid part, the outer part of this bark is actually called periderm. That is the botanical name for it. And the oxygen cannot get through that hard covering. Will come in here and get to those cell division layers I was talking to you about. Cell division requires metabolism. Metabolism requires oxygen, and so it's really cool to know that trees can breathe in the winter. So here is an example of lenticels. So those dots that you see on some trees, and the lenticels that you see on birch, these horizontal lines, they are lenticels. All right, and they can be very different depending on the tree. They can be conspicuous or they can be not conspicuous. And yes, the buds can be your best buds. Depending on the trees, they're great to identify trees with. I mentioned the long, slender ones of the beech, the two colored ones of the birch, the ash, the nice round, with just two scales there, or three of the ash. And then when you see this kind of grouping of multiple buds at the end, it's in the sort of St. Lawrence, the forest region that we're in right now, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence, with red oak, white oak, you're going to see these multiple buds at the end. So that's an oak tree feature. All right, and this is where it gets really interesting in my mind. And it's when I say what does not leave without a trace, well, tree leaves don't. They leave a scar. And this is where it gets microscopic. We're going to need your like a hand lens to go out and look at this. And it's really fascinating. When I learned about, as a student, when I learned about vein scars and leaf scars, I actually cried a little bit. Like it was just so fascinating to be so amazing that plants create these features, and it makes the twig look so beautiful. So this is black ash, and here's a black ash leaf. The whole leaf is comprised of leaflets. So you can get sort of a simple leaf like a maple leaf, but you can get these compound leaves like in black ash. So just using this as an example. And it's attached to the stem in the middle picture here. So this is the stalk of that leaf. And there are veins. There are veins, as you know, in leaves, and there are major veins that occur, like the bigger ones you see, and then the minor veins that are produced within the leaf blade area. The major veins of these leaves go down. They actually follow down, excuse me, the stalk of the leaf, and they go into and connect themselves. The middle picture here with the stem or the twig area, and it makes sense. These veins are highways for food transport and water transport, so it makes sense that they are attached. But what happens when they fall off in the fall? They leave a scar. They leave a scar here, and this is a real prominent scar that you'll see in black ash. And we actually call this sort of smiley face because it sort of looks like a smiley face. So you have the leaf scar, so that's when that leaf fell off in the middle there, and the vein scars here are from those veins. And the leaf scar and vein scars will give you an idea, and it sometimes comes down to the point of attachment here of the leaf scar and vein scars, which will tell you the difference maybe between like different maples, different birches. It's just fascinating. All right, we'll move on. And when I say the beauty of a twig, I just find that twigs are a beautiful piece of art in nature. When you find out more about them, their color, their texture, the way the buds look, they are just beautiful. So I'm going to just mention a few things about of twig anatomy that I haven't. So this is like that end twig, that young twig, and we talked about the lenticels. This is an auxiliary bud. I call them lateral buds, but they can be called auxiliary buds. So we'll be saying that they're lateral buds in the talk. Leaf scars, we've talked about leaf scars, and in there there'll be little buds, vein scars from those veins, and the bud scale scars down here. And the only thing, just to mention what node and internode means, if you don't know, the nodes are a point of attachment on a stem or a twig. So you'll see bud or leaf or both at the nodes, sometimes flowers. And then the internode is the area of the stem between nodes. So a stem itself or twig is composed of nodes and internodes. So there's a node, and then the internode is in between. So once in a while you hear that, what does the bud look at the node? So you'll know. Okay. And just to show you, I'll go through this quickly, like tree identification in the winter, as far as barks, twigs, and buds, all these different features that you can use. When I first learned about bark and twigs, I thought I had no idea that all these types of features were present. With the bark, is it rough or smooth? Obvious pattern of ridges or depressions? Do they have peeling flakes? Shiny? Do they have certain markings? What's the color? What's the color of the bark? Age differences, it makes it a little difficult, as I mentioned before. Twigs, smooth or hairy. They can be smooth or hairy at the beginning, and later on, when they're older, they They can be hairy than smooth. Like you have to sort of watch that. Are they slender or stout? Like when you look at a twig, you know, just from one tree, you might think, well, I don't know. But when you compare it to another tree, like does it look slender or does it look stout? Are the lenticels prominent and what's their shape? Are there thorns or spines? I'm not going to be talking about trees with thorns or spines. When you think of Crataegus, like hawthorn, there's thorns. Thorns are actually modified branches, and spines are modified leaves. And we think they're there, of course, to keep the herbivores away so they don't get eaten. Odor, some twigs will have an odor, and I've mentioned about the leaf scars and the vein scars. Now buds, I'll be talking about arrangement on the twig, which is a very important feature when you first start looking at trees. What are the shape of buds, color? Some of them have one, some two. How many bud scales are there? That's what happens. Some have 8, some have 3. The shape of bud scales, are the buds shiny? Are they hairy? Do they have hairs? Lots of things. I know this is lots of information coming at you. And again, my email's at the end if you need more information for sure. All right, we're going to talk about some local trees now in Muskoka and in probably some of your areas too, outside Muskoka, where you're from now. And just so you know, we'll be talking about these plants, but we're talking also about tools that you use to name trees. So there might be trees that you have that aren't these species or groups of plants that we're talking about, and you'll be able to go out and start looking using identification features. All right, so all those trees there we'll be covering, and I just want to talk about this bud arrangement. Where there's a leaf, on most plants in the world, where there's a leaf that you see, there will be a bud in the axil of that leaf. Okay, so when we talk about leaf arrangement, is how they're arranged on the stem or the twig if they haven't fallen off yet, and it's the same. If their leaf arrangement was opposite, in other words, two buds to a node, you know that there will also be buds there, buds to a node when that leaf disappears. So that's something good to know. Okay, we're going to go now. I'm not going to go, sorry. We're going to go with the arrangement first. This is when you go out and you look at trees, this is the first thing you're going to say, okay, what's the bud arrangement here? Is it opposite or is it alternate? Another bud arrangement is whorled. I won't be talking about that, but most of the trees we have here are either opposite or alternate. And most of the trees are actually alternate. So opposite leaf bud arrangement, the terminal bud, some plants will have a terminal bud. There won't be any leaf scars there. But when we think of arrangement, we're looking at laterals, okay, lateral buds. So opposite leaf bud arrangement, 2 to a node all the way. And there's some leaf scars here. The buds are not there. They might have fallen off too, but there's leaf scars. And again, the scars are going to be there too. They're going to have that kind of arrangement because the leaves used to be there. Alternate, most of the trees are alternate in the area, and that's when one bud to a node, okay? Because there used to be one leaf to a node there. And they're just ranged up like that throughout the stem or the twig. All right, so that's the first thing to look at. So we're going to look at the opposite bud arrangement with some examples now, and maple and ash are opposite bud arrangement. And there's also dogwood in the area. I won't be talking about that, but that also has an opposite bud arrangement, and some other shrubs, or some shrubs. But maple and ash are the two biggies for this talk. We're going to look at some identification features now. So maples and ashes. With maples, the twigs are fairly slender compared to ashes, which are fairly stout. The buds are somewhat pointed in maples, where the buds are broadly rounded in ashes. So I'm going back and forth here with this information. I just don't want to put this here to distract you. And now buds are pointed compared to ashes with maples, but when you compare the buds of maples with beeches, they're not as pointed. So, but when you're looking at opposite bud arrangement, then you're sort of narrowing this down now. Okay, I'm looking at maples and ashes. The leaf scars in maples with 3 to 7 separate and distinct vein scars. So it's quite distinct. Where the ashes, as we saw with black ash, the leaf scars with vein scars that look numerous and joined in a line, if you remember, and I'll be showing that to you again, and looking like a smiley face. Where the leaf scars, they're actually sort of rounded in ash. I didn't mention that, but leaf scars are more narrow and crescent shaped with maples. So we're going to look at a couple of different maples here. And the common name I'm going to give you, and the common name can vary depending on, not necessarily sugar maple, but with different plants, depending on where you are in Canada, even in Ontario, in the world, if these plants show up, and sometimes in Britain, we'll have the same trees as here. And you can't rely on that. Sometimes even localities or communities will call their trees certain common names. But the one that you can always count on, the name that will always be the same for that particular individual plant is the Latin name. And a Latin name is a binomial name. We have, as humans, Homo sapiens. Homo is the genus and sapiens is the species name. So together as humans, we have Homo sapiens as our Latin name. So Acer is the Latin name for the genus of maple, and Saccharum is the species name for sugar maple. So sugar maple then would be Acer saccharum. And Acer has, like most genera out there, have more than one species. So you'll have that Acer as at the front of the different, like red maple would have a different one, silver maple would have a different species name, but they would always have Acer. All right, sugar maple, the bark on the left, and I'll be showing you bark features on the left, and then twig and bud features on the right with each of these slides. And on the top right is your maple leaf. So that will always be showing the leaf of the species. So sugar maple, gray bark with vertical red ridges curled outward along one side. And the twigs are gray or brown, slender and shiny with lighter lenticels compared to other maples. The terminal bud is quite pointy and brown with 6 to 8 pairs of scales. So you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think I started to, this one has 8, that's right. So the terminal bud at the end is quite pointy with 6 to 8 pairs of scales. Sometimes there'll be features that we'll hear about and read about as far as the terminal bud is concerned, and other times it'll be about the lateral buds. All right, red maple, Acer rubrum. Again, opposite arrangement here. Grayish bark, brown bark with scaly ridges, so a little bit more scaly than the sugar maple, fastened at the center and loose at the ends. The twigs are redder, like they're sort of to grayish brown, but depending on where you are and sometimes the environment, it's a little bit tricky, but they have quite small lenticels also, and so does the sugar maple. The terminal bud is reddish though, and more blunt than the sugar maple, with only 4 pairs of bud scales this time. And the crescent shape, kind of V-shaped leaf scar down here showing the vein scars, that is quite, they're pretty much crescent shape or V-shaped in maples in general. And this shows the lateral bud right here in the notch. Okay, ashes too, and there's a couple ashes I'm going to show you. We're still with the opposite bud arrangement, light gray with fine furrows and a regular diamond pattern, the bark, and the twigs are shiny purplish or with a grayish skin. First pair of lateral buds. Now this is interesting. First pair of lateral buds below the terminal bud, like I'm showing you here, the bottom, touch the bottom of the terminal bud, and that'll give you a different feature between the white ash and the black ash. So there's no space here in the twig between that terminal bud and that round type lateral bud. So they touch, and the leaf scar is U-shaped, and these are actually flowers here. Okay, sometimes you'll have them on there. Okay, black ash, Fraxinus nigra, light gray bark with this time it's corky ridges, so you can put your fingernail in there and don't harm the tree though, and kind of indent it a little bit. And the first pair of lateral buds on this beautiful twig of black ash are below the terminal bud. Okay, the first laterals are below the terminal bud, so there's a space there, and that's something that's different from other ashes. Okay, so, and the nice brown, dark brown buds, and the leaf scar is round, as we saw before. Okay, well, that's for we're going into now categories for tree ID. That was for the opposite, now the alternate bud arrangement. And we're going to get a little bit more detailed here and sort of divide things up a little bit. So the alternate bud arrangement, whether a terminal bud is present or whether a terminal bud is absent. And that just means the end bud is not a true terminal bud. Okay, it sort of falls off very early in development. So but you'll notice that the terminal bud is quite terminal if it is present, right? The terminal bud, the laterals that will be at the end of a twig, if the terminal bud is absent, are kind of off at an angle and look a lot like the lateral buds. Okay, within the terminal bud present, we go into poplar and aspen, leaf scars with 3 or fewer vein scars. So it gets that microscopic. And then oak and beech are leaf scars with 4 or more vein scars. Within the terminal bud absent, it's the same categories here as over here. The leaf scars with 3 or few vein scars, birch and elm, and leaf scars with 4 or more vein scars, basswood. Now, some of you will be able to identify these trees without even looking into vein scars, but it's just when you're down to sort of the nitty gritty of trying to figure out the difference between, within, sometimes they can look so different, so similar, some of these trees, that you will get down to the vein scars, but sometimes you'll be fine. All right, we're going to start with leaf scars with 3 or fewer vein scars. Balsam poplar, Populus balsamifera, gray bark with scaly ridges. The twigs are reddish brown, beautiful, buds large, especially the terminal bud, which is right here. Buds are gummy and fragrant, so you can bring in that odor, with 5 bud scales, period. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Trembling aspen, another Populus tremuloides, the leaves that tremble in the fall and the spring and summer, beautiful. Mature bark is dark, and this is the picture here. Firm to long, flat top ridges. Younger bark, pale green to whitish, and this is where you see those stands of beautiful aspen. The twigs, reddish brown, and may have a waxy phylum that's grayish. Buds are not, they don't have any odor, and they may or may not be gummy, but sometimes they are. And this time, instead of 5, the bud scales are 6 to 7. And the buds tips of these buds, the tips of the buds will curve inward a little bit. So that gives you, an idea that that's Populus tremuloides, trembling aspen. 3 or fewer vein scars. Now we're moving into 4 or more vein scars with terminal bud present, right? Oak and beech. Love the red oak. I love them all. Alternate bud arrangement, red oak, Quercus rubrum. On the left there, bark is firmly furrowed and rigid, or ridged, I should say. Inner bark is a little pinkish red color to it. And what I have at the bottom here for you showing that multiple buds at the end in the terminal area, which is a clear sign of oak. And these nice lateral buds here in the axil of the leaves that haven't fallen off yet. And here is, you can't see the grouping, that's why I have it there as much as normally it is, but the twig is shiny reddish brown, sometimes with immature acorns on the tree, and the buds are somewhat pointed and tall, but you look at that bud, and it doesn't look as pointed as a beech or even maple, but when you compare it to the next picture, which is white oak, Quercus alba, the Quercus alba buds are a little bit more rounded. The bark is a little more scaly, not as ridged as the oak bark, red oak bark, narrowly ridged, somewhat scaly, as I mentioned. And the twigs are red-brown, somewhat gray, and are often shiny or waxy. Multiple red-brown terminal buds that are, as I said, more rounded and smaller. Okay, so we're leaf scars with 4 more vein scars, and we're just going to give you the beech here with that before we move on to the absentee of that terminal bud. American beech. Fagus grandifolia, talked about that beautiful smooth bark here, light bluish gray bark remains smooth even on mature trees, and those nice twigs with the long buds. And I showed the bud there. They're slender, the twigs zigzag and light brown. Buds are long and light brown and slender, covered with overlapping scales. So that looks so different than some of the buds I've showed you, which are more in rows. So those overlapping scales that are tinged with a little bit of gray fuzz there at the end. And the leaf scar on the right there, and actually that looks like it's kind of a smiley face too. That's more sort of semicircle in shape. And I hope I'm not going too fast because I'm looking at the time, but I hope I'm not going too fast because I just love to talk. But we're nearing the end of the number of trees here. So the terminal bud absent, leaf scars with 3 or few vein scars, good old white birch. Betula, peperifera, papery, creamy white birch, often shedding in these large sheets, and just put a careful out there not to take off these sheets. You can kill a tree. They can get wounded and get pathogens inside, so just be very careful. You might want to pick up from the forest floor with the shedding bark. Twigs are reddish brown with prominent lentils, so you can see them, from here. But definitely they're very prominent. Lateral buds on longer shoots with 1 to 3 visible bud scales. Sometimes on the shorter shoots, not as visible, but with 1 to 3 visible bud scales. And the bud scales are green towards the base and brown toward the tips. So down here, you see it towards the base is green, and right here is red. So it's actually two shades. Catkins, okay. There are sometimes you get the flowers, which are catkins on birch, create the pollen. And the male catkins there. And yellow birch, Petula eleganensis. Oh, sometimes I have tar. Eleganensis. There we go. Mature bark, dark bronze, large ragged edged plates on lower trunk. So it doesn't always show this young bark here. The older it's more kind of like plated look. Not readily peeling. And sort of yellowish in color. The young twigs are uniformly brown, hairy, wintergreen smell. So that's the difference between the white birch and the yellow birch, is you'll have a wintergreen smell with yellow birch. And the buds with 2 shades of brown this time were the white birch was brown, 2 types of, green and brown, and this time 2 shades of brown. So you get sort of a lighter brown and a darker brown. And the lateral buds with 1 to 3 bud scales. White elm and other terminal bud absent, leaf scars with 3 or fewer vein scars. I hope everybody's following me there. White elm, Ulmus americana, they're quite shaggy, scaly looking with age, and bark shows alternate layers of light and dark. So you sort of light and then dark and light and then dark. And the twigs are somewhat slender, slightly zigzag, reddish brown. Beautiful buds, reddish brown, end bud bent a bit. So that's one of the giveaways here. Okay, we don't have a terminal bud, so it's not like sticking straight out there. And so the end bud of white elm just sort of goes off on an angle. But the lateral buds are flattened and pressed against the twig. And this time you have bud scales that are 4 or more in regular rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, as opposed to, overlapping, or some things we, showed in the sugar maple and the red maple. Lots of little differences. Finally, we're getting the last one, leaf scars with 4 or more vein scars. And I don't know why, I love tree, but basswood, I don't know. There's just something about I just love, and I think a lot of it has to do with this really neat up here in the right-hand corner where it produces that fruit flower, and they have these neat stipules that come out, the appendages, and you say, oh, that's a basswood. We know that one. Tilia americana, long, straight trunk, bark with long, narrow ridges, and the buds slightly zigzag, smooth. The twigs are yellowish brown. The buds are stout, so they look pretty stout compared to some of those pointy ones we saw. Reddish, really pretty. Asymmetrical bud scales this time. So, and they have just 2 visible. Okay, so and there might be another one behind there, but 1 and 2, and they're asymmetric, so they're not those nice, neat rows. And this time, the leaf scars are like incredibly a lot. 4 to 10. Sorry, leaf scars have a lot of vein scars, 4 to 10. And there's more in this category, okay, but I just wanted to show you that one with Tilia. Lots of information, okay, so we're going to finish off with a few more slides here. Now, dichotomous key, and not to, it doesn't mean key like fruit keys that we see, with maples and birches and things. With maples and elms, but it is a key that we use, a written key, that we use to identify trees. And we just went through a dichotomous key in some way. It's a tool used in identification and classification of organisms and biology. It helps identify organisms by directing the user to look at known organisms. So it could be animal organisms, it could be plant organisms, and dichotomous means divided into two parts. So hence, dichotomous keys always present two choices based on the key characteristics of the organism in each step. So when you look at a written key in a plant identification book, they'll have all the known, it might be a key based on the genus, like, oh, look at all the maples here, a maple key, an acer key, but it might be also, maples versus birches versus, and they have winter keys in some books. So it's when you take a plant, you don't know what it is, then you go to these keys to find out what it is. And as I said, we went through one. We had opposite bud arrangement. You see the dichotomy here. There's two choices on each step. Opposite bud arrangements, maple ashes. Okay, let's go to 2 if you have alternate. Then in the book you go to 2. This is quite an easy key compared to some of the keys you'll find, but it's a good place to start. Terminal bud present, you go to 3 down here, but terminal bud absent, you go to 4. Leaf scars with 3 or fewer vein scars, poplar and aspen. 4 or more, 3 or fewer, 4 or more. So that's what we call a dichotomous key. Now, where do we go from here? Okay, what you need to go out and identify some of these features is a hand lens. And sometimes your basics are 5 or 10 times might not do the trick, depending on your eyesight. 20 times medication might be better to see some of those leaf scars. And also a ruler, leaf scars and vein scars. And also a ruler is nice to take out in the field because you can measure like buds size, for example, like the length of buds and other things. And one thing I want to mention too is when you go out and you identify trees or plants or anything, you take lots of shots, like of the bark, plants that are around them, the young bark, and then the whole tree. And just remember to write down, let's say 1. I think that's red oak. Okay, I'm going to take a picture of its bark and everything, and I'm going to put 1 in my field book and go 1, and then first pictures or something. And what I do when I finish taking a picture of that red oak and I'm moving on to, let's say, a beach, then I'll take a picture of just the forest floor or something, or maybe, person you're going out with their face or something. And then you'll know that, okay, I'm moving on to the next species. Because when you get home, you look at all your digital shots, you'll say, well, where was that? And what was that? So it gives you sort of like that I'm going on to the next tree now. And the other thing, you not necessarily have to cut off branches to identify them. I mean, we want to let trees grow. So, take a picture of the ends. You can always go back and take a look. And you can also tell differences of trees by their wood. But I don't, want you to be cutting down trees and doing that. But that's what foresters do. You can actually tell differences of trees and their wood by the cells. It's just absolutely amazing. Okay, so a couple books here. Actually, this is the one book. This is the Trees of Canada, what I would recommend. This is a new version, John Farrar, the late John Farrar, amazing morphologist and tree identification person. Just amazing. And he taught at the University of Toronto just before I taught there. I had to fill huge shoes as I was there as a sort of lecturer in tree biology for a little bit before I went out west. And the early version is just fine. But what I like about this book is that it does have pictures of buds and pictures of twigs, like drawings and beautiful pictures of trees for identification. A lot of the books that you'll go to identify trees with don't have like that twig information. It's more of an identification book. They're good and everything, but they're more of an identification book for spring and summer. So this is why these are good. And you'll have other twig identification books out there that have like huge keys. And if you're really serious about it, that's great. And there's also, websites. There's winter tree ID keys that you can just go and look at YouTube videos. And there's description of, I say Ontario trees, but there's, all across. I know the BC guides for plants are just amazing out in BC. I remember looking at them. So there's lots of things. But again, please let me know if you have any questions. I know I'm getting close to the end here. These are some of the pictures that I took from the web, and some of them pictures were my own and my husband's too. But before we go, I just want you to click in the chat what tree you think this is. This is just a little quiz. I haven't talked about it. And I can't see the chat, but I want to, if Aaron could tell me what people are writing.
Hey, Jane, we've got about 10 people saying tamarack so
All
far.
right. Okay, this is, I didn't, that way to go, tamarack. This is our only deciduous conifer species. So trees, the twigs of, or the leaves, I should say, of conifers are a little bit in bunches, right? And they fall off in this fall. So it's our only coniferous tree that is deciduous. So they're amazing, and they're the ones that turn beautiful golden yellow in the fall, and they've got those little tiny cones. Okay, so there you go. I just wanted to see. So that's great. Tamarack. All right. And I know we don't have tons of time. I'm sorry, but questions or discussion.
That's okay. I've got some questions to go through. First one is, can you describe, or do you know anything about using animal browse as a means of identification?
Animal browsing?
Yes.
Ooh. As far as identification, I do know that there are some alders and there are like maples, like there are browsing that occurs out there. And so you go out there and say, okay, where the heck is that terminal bud? As far as identification, well, it's gone because browsing occurs, and the animals just love to browse the ends of branches of most, I would say, of most trees, but the ones, as I mentioned, I know maple, I've seen the browsing, and I've seen them with alder and birch, but there are sometimes compounds in plants that will stop browsing because they don't want to be browsed. But some plants want to be browsed, because what happens is when you have a plant that is, normally plants want to sort of grow tall, right, with that terminal bud so that they can get the most light. But some plants don't mind being browsed because that allows the terminal bud, the apical dominance of the terminal bud, to be released. Because the terminal bud will grow the farthest, will grow the tallest, and the lateral buds sometimes grow just a little bit, or sometimes they remain dormant because the terminal bud is boss. So what the plant kind of likes to do is, well, not necessarily the plant likes to do it, sometimes it likes to get bushy, depending on the environmental condition, but it's actually what I remember now, what the animal likes is that when it browses and it takes that terminal bud off, it actually causes the lateral buds to be released, so it gets more food. So we think that there is some sort of connection between browsing and the way the buds, lateral buds, are moved out. So I don't think I answered your question. If there's anybody else that hasn't answered that as far as identification with browsing, but that's a really good question, and I can look into more information on that.
Okay, and I've got another one. This isn't quite, it's tree related. Do you have any thoughts on BTK spray for severe gypsy moth outbreak? They're concerned about the impact on non-target species of caterpillars.
You know, I just don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, and I wouldn't want to hazard a guess. And sorry, can you just say the question again of that?
Yeah, so it's concerning BTK spray for gypsy moth outbreak.
Yeah,
and they're wondering if non-target species of caterpillars will be affected.
Yeah, I just don't know the answer to that. Sorry, and but I can look into that.
Yeah, and I can add just a little bit.
Yeah, if you want to, Aaron, you know a lot.
Yeah, so there's about 2,500 species of moth caterpillars and probably 100 or more species of butterfly caterpillars. So when you're targeting a single species, I don't know if we have any selective enough sprays to target only a single species. I would say if you're looking for like the safest way of gypsy moth removal, it would be finding the egg sacs on the trees and just scraping them off. It's not going to get all of them, but it's probably going to be a little bit, well, it'll definitely be more selective because you'll be selecting the egg masses to take off the trees.
Well, in general, are they sprays selective at all though? Like I don't know if
I don't. That's something I don't know either. But I would say the safer way is definitely like doing doing it by hand.
And I just want to mention just that, of course, I'm saying, you know, get outside, and it is a great time of year to get outside. And of course, you want to stay physically distanced and everything. But I want to say that now is the time to go because the weather is getting nicer and the buds haven't flushed yet in most of the area, but they will start eventually. So it's a good time to go. And you can see those leaves on the ground too, to give you that tip. There's one other thing I wanted to mention about, I'll think of it. Anyway, go ahead, Aaron.
Okay, another one is, are there common signs to show a tree is in distress?
I would say one of the most common signs is that they will turn, their leaves will turn brown before they turn another color that they should be turning in the fall. And there was a really, really hot fall we had 3 years ago, just when Dave and I retired here, and it was very warm. And I found that leaves, they were turning brown before they were turning red or green, or sorry, or orange or yellow, the normal colors. So that would be one. Sometimes they won't be producing as many flowers or fruits on their trees. They will be like sort of die back. So the twigs will start to die, and the crown won't be as full. And then if you look on the bark, sometimes you'll see pathogens or sort of a mottled look to some, but sometimes it actually should be there. So it is a sign of a like identification feature, but you will see sort of a look that isn't quite, the bark just looks unhealthy, just doesn't look the same. So I would say not as many leaves turning a strange color, and the twigs dying, becoming dry. And it's either due to climatic conditions or things that humans, you know, do as far as spraying, etc.
Yeah, and one thing I will add to that is if you're looking for like invasive species damage, like emerald ash borer or something, you'll also start seeing some trees shooting. So they'll send up new shoots from basically the roots of the main tree. And when you start seeing that, it can show that there's some impact to the tree.
Yeah.
Are the lenticels used for breathing only on new branches, or are they also on the trunk?
That's a really good question. New branches definitely will have the lenticels on them, but lenticels are used all over the tree because the trunk of the tree is still dividing as far as the growth rings. So they will have the most growth rings at the bottom of a tree trunk, and at the base of a branch, there's also the most growth rings because that's the oldest part of the twig or the branch. So you will have lenticels. There might not be as many of them at the bottom and the older part of a tree, probably more of them in the newer parts, but there are still air holes throughout the whole tree.
And another follow-up one is there a good dichotomous key app?
Yes. Yeah, I use them. So, and I don't know them right now, but if you would email me, I will let you know, because they're, well, actually, Dichotomous Key app. Sorry, I thought you were talking about a key that you see online that you can go on and then sort of you can sort of go through a quiz. But I tried to look for one and I couldn't find one, but I know there's like a really good leaf identifier. But if anyone finds a winter key app that would identify like buds and twigs, please let me know. Great.
Okay, and we just have
Great questions. Yeah.
one more question. And if anyone still has a question that I haven't answered, actually there might be two questions, sorry. Lenticels are for breathing on bark. Is this similar to the stomata on leaves, but it also allows them to breathe through the winter? Or is this different from the stomata?
Okay, great. Another great question. Very good thinking question. As far as somebody is really thinking, that's great. Stomata. Stomata are pores on the green growth. So yes, they breathe as well as the lenticels. The pores or stomata on leaves, and they're also on stems. So pretty well anything green you see out there, you're going to find stomata. And the stomata, they have guard cells and they will open and close depending on whether they want to close up because they want to keep water inside, or they want to open in order to take in CO2 in photosynthesis. So they go open and close. So they are sort of dynamic in a sense. Now, Stomata is only on green growth, and they're also actually on petals of flowers too. But the lenticels are only on woody growth. So woody growth doesn't have stomata because they would not be, like, it's dead tissue in a sense. Like the periderm, the bark is dead. Tissue is still functional, but it's dead. And stomata require living tissue because they're movements, they open and close. So lenticels are the breathing pores, so when of this the dead tissue of bark. And they also so as a branch that have leaves will have stomata on the leaves and the stems, the green stems, and then they'll have the lenticels on the twig itself. So it's great.
Okay, some plants start with opposite bud development, and as they mature, the new growth will change to alternate bud development for the purposes of bonsai. Is there a way to flip this back to opposite? That might be out of your
I think it is out.
knowledge.
Yeah, but that's a really good question too. But I will mention just a little tidbit that you get some forms of ivy, and they'll have, or some forms of other plants that they'll have plants that have a certain alternate or opposite leaf arrangement at the beginning, and then when they get older, they'll change to the other arrangement, and we call that heteroblasty, because the leaves are different when the young stage compared to the older stage. And that can happen on trees to some degree too. Excuse me, but as far as the bonsai is concerned, I just don't know, but that's interesting.
And then the last question I've got is, do you have any tips on pruning fruit trees?
Pruning fruit trees. Sounds like a question for Laura, last webinar person. Laura, I'm not trying to put you on the spot there. Pruning fruit trees, and I'm sorry I can't answer that last question because I don't do a lot of that. I'm just thinking here. I think the best time to do it is early in the spring before they start to bud out, or in the fall, if I'm not mistaken, but not when they're growing. That's one thing I think I do know. So, but I wish I knew more about that. I'm less of a horticulturist than I am sort of a biologist in the field. So, but please send me that, and probably your somebody at a garden center would be able to help a little bit more with exactly how to do that. But I do know there's certain times of year that are better. It's better to do things when plants are sleeping a bit, so you don't disturb them too much.
Okay.
I'm sure there might be people out there that know more about that than I do, and I wish we had more time.
And Laura just wrote in the chat that she doesn't know enough about fruit trees. So
sorry, Laura.
Okay, so I think that's all the questions we have. Thank you everyone for participating. Again, we'll have it on the website hopefully in the next, I'll probably have it up by the end of the week. Takes a little bit of time to get it onto YouTube and edit and all that. So it'll be available if you want to rewatch and double check some of the slides that Jane had. And if you want to call or email Jane, her email's right there, and I think she'd happily have some additional questions through that. So yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in, and yeah,
and thank you too to everyone. Yeah, sorry, Aaron, I just want to thank everybody. It was wonderful, and I hope you look at twigs in a different way now. And I just put that snow woman out there at the end just to show the different uses of twigs. Sorry,
thanks, Jane. Great job.
Okay.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you both. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody, for attending. Bye-bye.